Recording in progress. All right. Well, thanks so much for going over our quick housekeeping. Also, I will say we're going to have a hard stop at the 1 hour mark today to fully respect the time of our rock star, Dr. Desmarais, this morning. But she has graciously allowed us to post her contact information with the session recording that we will be putting on the website, the AltAc, the Alternative Academia Workshop Series website, posted on the larger DCS main page. All right, so we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. I'm not one of those people who loves to read a bio word for word, so I kind of took pieces out of it, but I am going to read so I don't screw anything up. Our rock star that we are chatting with this afternoon is Dr. Sarah Desmarais. She has been the Senior Vice President at Policy Research Associates, or PRA, since 2021. In this role, she's responsible for developing and providing oversight on research projects, as well as administrative and management duties. She received her PhD and master's, actually, in forensic psychology and law from Simon Fraser, and then in true interdisciplinary fashion, completed a postdoc fellowship in the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia. Prior to joining PRA, Dr. Desmarais was a tenured professor of psychology at the North Carolina State University. Dr. Desmarais' her work centers on issues at the intersection of public health, community safety, and social justice. Particularly, her research is focused on evidence-based practices for reducing detention rates, especially among people with behavioral health needs. And as we will chat about, part of the work that she does involves providing technical assistance, evaluation services, and consultation to behavioral health, criminal justice, and intelligence agencies throughout the US and abroad. So clearly, we have an esteemed rock star in the room, and we are really excited to have this conversation. So before we really get going, Dr. Desmarais, I was hoping you might be able to talk to us a bit about your background and kind of the driving force behind why you do what you do and the path you've taken.
Sure. First of all, Sarah's fine. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. As you said, I've had all of the career paths, so I'm happy to talk about any of them that come up. I came to do my PhD and all this work really with high kind of objectives of wanting to make the world a better place. And I was really passionate about psychology and the intersection with the legal system and law. And at that point sought out a program specifically that was focused on that intersection. There aren't many of them in Canada. And also that was from the beginning very applied in nature. So part of the reason I chose to go to Simon Fraser was it obviously had a great reputation in training and in what I wanted to do. But also part of their program was doing a research practicum where you were doing research in an applied setting. And that was like part of what they did. So from the very beginning, I have always wanted to do research that matters, do research that was going to change policy. I wrote on my grad school applications that I wanted to change Canadian policy as it related to the justice system. And then, for 20 years, that's really been what I'm doing in every space that I have ever gone to.
I love I think so many of us come in wanting to make a really big difference. So I love that you've kind of highlighted that and have that to be a driving force through kind of all of these different positions that you've taken. So given your bio and your recent comments, we know that you have a pretty interdisciplinary background. Your doctoral degree and your postdoc work are in two complementary but different subject matter areas. So a lot of policy evaluation, behavioral health, systems work, all of that sort of stuff, super multidisciplinary. But can you share a bit about your specific pathway? What was it that made you want to look for actually a different subject matter area for your postdoc?
Yeah. So I will say too, my actual master's and PhD itself was interdisciplinary. So we did our psychology as there were different tracks, but we did a primary emphasis on psychology. And then I also went to law school at the same time because I was really interested. Some folks were interested in the kind of litigation and the courtroom processing, and I was wanting to understand a bit more about just how to understand the law and how people interface with it. So it was that from the beginning, and that was really exciting to me. And then I was working clinically in jails doing mental health intake as placements during my graduate training. And doing that assessment work was really impactful. It was felt like very like, this is what I wanted to do. And also incredibly hard. And I was feeling like I was hearing the same story from almost every single person that came through the system, that came through my door for an assessment. And I started to feel more and more like there needed to be, or I needed anyway, to have a bigger picture understanding of how these people were coming into the system. And a lot of what I was hearing was very early childhood homelessness and substance use and abuse and neglect. And, you know, it all kind of like made sense why this person was sitting in front of me at the front door of a detention center instead of thriving, and wondering how that we could have bigger system change. And so for me, that's where I knew and had colleagues who had touched on the field of public health. And I just sought out a very specific person that was doing work in this at the University of British Columbia that one of my mentors knew and had done work with. And I really just kind of sought out training in another area. I'm also a very big methods nerd. So I want to just emphasize that you can be a big like methods, quant, whatever kind of research methodologist nerd outside of the university setting too. And I was interested in learning the methods they used in public health and understanding, you know, how their stats and their approaches differed. And so, yeah, I found that work, and that actually really informed the next 10 years or so of my career.
That's great. You know, we talk a lot about kind of how you don't have to stick in one lane, kind of career space wise in order to do this good work. But at the same time, I think people, when they go into graduate work, they tend to kind of go down a rabbit hole, you know, like it's the same thing that you get deeper and deeper into. So I really like your, you know, your kind of approach that in order to do the best work, you have to have not only all the tools in your toolkit and all those skills, but having a really broad-based kind of understanding of how these things intersect. I love that, just kind of the unsiloing of this kind of knowledge, and really, you know, we emphasize the importance of multidisciplinary, but I think also at the same time, doctoral students sometimes get messaging around, you know, why would you research in so many different areas? Pick a place, stay in there, really expand on that. And I love that somebody who's incredibly successful, very, very well respected, how you really just kind of immediately knock that myth right down. And I'm very appreciative of that.
Yeah, I wanted to add, if you don't mind, sorry, interrupt, but
do.
you know, I feel so lucky. And, you know, we talked about this when we were planning the session, but I was surrounded by people who wanted to do interdisciplinary work, who wanted to do applied work. And I don't know if it was the specific program that I went to, if there are disciplinary differences between psychology and criminology too that are at play there. But, you know, it was really emphasized and supported in our program that we would take classes in criminology, that we would go to other departments to take other classes. And I just never heard, you know, at least that I was aware of, people being discouraged from doing that. And so that's, you know, so fortunate that more than 20 years ago now, I got that message, and it's like carried me forward. And it never even truly, to be honest, occurred to me that people didn't think highly of alternative spaces and alternative careers, because we were surrounded by it. We had cohorts ahead of us who had graduated and moved into, you know, government research settings or, you know, private companies or whatever in the areas around the university. And it was just so very entrenched in what we were doing but it was also a very highly respected academic program. And so it was kind of like, well, there was a lot of pressure to achieve, I think, but it was also just like, yeah, the work we're doing should matter. And that, stuck with me from day one of graduate school.
I love that message. I really, really do. Okay, so we know you did a postdoc. Now let's shift to post-postdoc. I think I remember you mentioning that you held a few different faculty positions. I don't know if they were all within the same university. And I think at that planning session, you mentioned, interestingly, that one of your positions was in a degree granting department, and one of them, while still a faculty member, was in a non-degree granting. So I was hoping that you could kind of talk about the different faculty positions you've had at universities, and then walk us through kind of the work. Was the work similar in those various university positions?
Yeah, so my first job was as a faculty member. I would say that during my graduate career, I also worked as a research assistant, and during my postdoc too, as a research scientist in a forensic psychiatric hospital. So it was even more disciplinary than it looks like on my CV, because I was also doing research with psychiatrists and social workers, and we were doing policy work at that point already. And then from there, when I was going onto the job market, I did go onto the traditional academic job market, but I went like very focused with the intent of going to programs that were, first of all, psychology and law or forensic psychology. That was something very kind of specific in the space that I wanted to look at. And then my first job from that was at the University of South Florida. And you're right, it was in a non-degree granting department. So I was on faculty in the Department of Mental Health, Law, and Policy. It was interdisciplinary. We were from all different backgrounds. And so I worked with lawyers and economists and PhDs in social work, including my husband, who I met there. So we were all from various disciplines, clinical psychology, criminology, all over the place, but we were all united by the work in this topical area. And the position I got hired into was funded by NIDA, so the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, to develop researchers in this a specific content area around co-occurring disorders in the criminal justice system. So my position when I went there was 75% research and 25% like more traditional other stuff. But we didn't have degree granting programs, so we would teach in other departments. And I had a joint appointment with the School of Community and Family Health in public health at the University of South Florida. So when I taught, I would teach one class in that graduate program. And then the rest of the time we were doing research and technical assistance in a university setting, but out in the community. So, to me, I didn't even really know that that was so unusual until I started talking to people down the road. But I very specifically sought out that opportunity because I wanted to keep doing the things I was doing. So that's where I went. And then I will be very honest, there were personal and professional reasons that we were leaving the University of South Florida. And one of the things that I realized after, this was now several years out of psychology, is that I did love that psychology individual focus. And I wanted to come back to that a little bit. There was a position open at North Carolina State University in what was known then as their psychology in the public interest program. And it just really sounded like a great fit. It fit with where my partner at the time was regionally looking for jobs as well. And so then that's how I ended up back in a psychology department. But that psychology department is also not your typical psychology department. So it's a land grant institution, meaning that part of the mission of the university is to give back and do work that kind of enhances the community. So I love that. And then all of the programs in our psychology department, and one of my colleagues from that psychology department is on here, Vanessa Volpe, hi. And so that whole department, there are 5 PhD programs and they're all applied in nature. So even in that department, there was no real devaluing of applied work. in fact, we all did applied work. They may not know what we're doing or why we were doing it, but they would think it was cool or like, that's important, you should do that. So even there, at North Carolina State, even though it was a Research One institution, it was a very traditional academic unit, there was still a real emphasis on doing kind of research that was affecting change in the real world.
Seeing these trends of very applied at all stages of your schooling into your different positions. I will say, I know about different topical, research centers, research institutes at universities that are associated usually with a very specific department. But having you talk about this department that was fully multidisciplinary, with everybody from all of these different backgrounds that are really united around the research questions that they're asking, and then just approaching them from so many different angles. I think that makes for a model for such better policy development and a really holistic understanding of what the data tells you in a specific area. So we all have, with our different methodological trainings and different backgrounds, we might ask the same question, but we do it in different ways. We do it looking at different data with different methods. So in order to really get a holistic, fully multifaceted understanding of something, I love this concept of taking it such a big approach like that, which I think is pretty different than a very specific research institute associated with a department. What about Shannon? I know you worked at a research institute when you were at George Mason, right?
I
What do you
did.
think about that?
I worked with Dr. Taxman at the Center for Advancing Correctional Excellence. And while it was embedded in a department, I would venture to say it took more of an interdisciplinary lens, because Dr. Taxman takes an interdisciplinary lens, right? That was a center focal point for the way that she approaches research, and that she wants to take a behavioral health approach. The co-director of the lab, Dr. Danielle Rudes, she is an organizational scientist by training who specializes in justice organizations, right? So she automatically is taking a more org psych approach to the way that she's doing things. So inherently it was more interdisciplinary. I've been kind of reflecting on this idea of why perhaps criminology specifically departments have, in my experience, been very hesitant to taking an interdisciplinary lens, or have been resistant at times, or outright overt about like not doing it. And I think it might be because the discipline itself is so young compared to psychology, compared to economics, right? Compared to sociology. And as kind of the grandbaby, so to speak, of sociology, I feel like it's for a long time had to say, no, we're our own discipline. We are not sociology. We are not psychology. And because of that, it's tried to carve its own sandbox of sorts. And then it's saying, building up its own criminological theories, of which we really only have one law as of yet, right, in criminology. And so where other disciplines have multiple laws because they have a long history of study and research. And I think that's in part perhaps why criminology is a little bit more hesitant to taking on this interdisciplinary lens. But the more I think we keep saying we're going to do it, and the more we have the Sarahs of the world doing it and modeling it, I think the more it makes it easier for crim departments to start opening the doors again and saying, okay, now that we are established and we all recognize that we are our own discipline and we're all going to give us credit for that, let's start working together. One thing though, Sarah, that you said that I think really resonates, particularly for students or even faculty mentoring students, is the idea that what you've described in your work history is alternative, traditional academic spaces, right? And that people might be interested in going into an AltAc industry space because they don't want to do heavy teaching, perhaps, or they don't want to do, they don't want to be beholden to contract grants, right? There's a whole reasons why people want to stay in university spaces. And what you've actually offered is looking for spaces that will do that, but with the structure and support of a university. So students looking for non-degree seeking departments. I think that's certainly an approach that students could take. Looking at land grant institutions, I want to be in the structure of a university. I want the support of a university, but I want to be giving back to my community. I want that to be a focal point. Then the way you might filter the way that you're looking for jobs is by looking at land grant institutions where that is a mission statement. So I think you really offered really thoughtful ways for students to think about all of the way where they can work, and maybe thinking outside the traditional R1 when they want to do research, but they want a mission focused research. And I think you've kind of offered that.
Yeah, what's interesting about that whole, I didn't know what an R1 or anything was when I got my first job, and I was like, oh, now I know. But it's always been for me about finding the fit, and I again, just feel very lucky that any mentor I've had is like, you find what works for you. And when I've wanted to go more academic, they were supportive. And, we'll get to when I left the academy as well. But yeah, that's just really interesting. Although I would say both of these institutions I've been at are R1 institutions where, they have really strong, reputations in research and grant getting. But I will add, because it's going to come up, my goal was always, how do I teach less? I love teaching. I just didn't want to do really more than one class a year. That was like always my goal, to try to hit just one class a year. It was just enough to enjoy that interaction with students. And then, honestly, my biggest passion is doing the research and sharing it out. And so that was, really for the last 15 years has been, how do I figure out how to do that?
There's no shame here. I think a couple of us have also found ways to do work without doing some heavy teaching. So there's no shame.
I would also say for those students on the conversation or on the call right now, a lot of psychology kind of PhDs are in crim departments. So one real obvious way to start looking at, if you're thinking down the road that you're wanting more alternative but still traditional academic spaces, would be to even just look at the backgrounds of faculty. George Mason is a great example. The department includes two really prominent psychologists, Allison Redlick, and then my own former student, Evan Lauder, who did her PhD with me at NC State in psychology. She also went on to do training in public health, and then, came back and is now in the criminology department at George Mason. So there's a lot of us that take these different paths, and I don't think we sometimes realize that when we see them listed on faculty pages.
Yeah, I completely agree. When you start digging into kind of the background and kind of what people actually do, it looks a little bit different at times than kind of what you see when you're looking at the faculty list or that sort of thing. Okay, so in the prep chat for this conversation today, you mentioned, as I mentioned before, that you disagree with this concept of needing to pick a lane. And instead you jumped around to find the right position that was the perfect fit for you, what and where you were most passionate about being at that time. You've already talked about a lot of the continuities among the work itself within all of the various spaces. So I'm wondering if you can chat quickly about the barriers that you experienced to doing your work, or maybe I should say the barriers you experienced to doing the work the way you want to do it. So of the places you've been, have you found any spaces that are kind of more or less challenging to doing the work the way you wanted to do it with the, without, as we all know in your current space, you don't have to work with course buyouts. So that's a big difference, I know.
Yeah. And, I guess we'll come to how I ended up here at PRA in a few minutes, but, being in the more traditional academic spaces, there were other pressures that were there. And I would also just, explicitly say, if it didn't come across, both of these prior, when I was on faculty, I was at public universities. and very beholden to state budgets and state priorities and shifting state politics. And so given the work that I do, that sometimes had an impact on what I was, you know, the freedom that I had to do various things, and also just really realistically, the funding that was available. So, you know, when I was at the University of South Florida, we had a very major state budget crisis while I was there. And one of the ways that it was dealt with was to put in major cuts to the state university budgets. And, you know, I think at the time they said University of South Florida lost 47% of our state funding one year.
Ooh.
That's pretty big when you're a state funded school. And so the job changed dramatically, and we had to start teaching more. And it was starting to move away from like all the things I loved about being there for a few different reasons. And then, you know, the other thing with the state university systems is that there are, you know, real actual restrictions on the dollars. So state budget, you know, for universities comes from usually state taxes and the taxpayer dollar, you know, and what it can be used for and what its purpose is. And so there was a lot of emphasis on, you know, teaching students in that state and what does that look like in terms of then if you are not teaching enough, for example, how many courses you could buy out of in terms of then what you would be able to do to give me that, you know, level of teaching that I wanted. And even though I think I was very successful in doing it, they really did value, I think, the community engagement and the outward facing work that I was doing at all these different universities. And even, you know, in the graduate school that I was in at the time before that. But it was like, that's all great, but this is your job. So at some level, it comes back to, you know, that I'm still in a faculty position, that I, you know, we have these expectations, and then all that other stuff that I was super excited and passionate and really wanting to do was extra. And then there was just even like interesting rules about what you can spend money on, depending on where it's coming from. And some of that doesn't change, frankly, in the AltAc spaces, but you might have more or less control over it in some of the academic spaces. So both of those universities were also huge, you know, 35,000 plus students. So there's just a lot more bureaucracy and levels to go up through for approvals for different things. So those were some of the many barriers.
Yep, those are barriers, absolutely. I appreciate your being kind of real about what the barriers were in different places. Okay, so one last question before we jump to your switch to PRA. Prestige. We talk a lot about prestige versus doing what's right for the person, finding the best fit. You used the language, you were very deliberate about your movements between positions. So I don't know if I necessarily have a question here, but I guess I'm wondering, do you have any words of wisdom around the concept of prestige as it relates to prioritizing how to find your position?
Oh, yeah, I do. let me clean them up. I will say my personal feeling is that you need to go where it is the best fit for you personally and professionally. I just don't care about prestige. I don't care about it. I didn't care about it where, you know, if I was looking at applicants coming in and where they had done their degrees or anything, I would be more interested. And for myself, I applied to programs that I thought I wanted to work in. I didn't apply to universities that I thought I wanted to work at, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know that I ever had heard of the University of South Florida or knew where it was before I knew about the program. Same with North Carolina State University. I mean, if you had asked me in grad school, first of all, if there was a North Carolina State University, I wouldn't have known that. And not just because I was in Canada, but probably part of that. I just think it's so important to go to where you're going to get what you need as a student And that's what I always told my students too. But then also, you know, if you're going to think about your career, I just really can't imagine picking a university because the name sounded good or was really well respected if the unit that I was going to wasn't. So there are some very famous Ivy League universities that I never would consider going to, well, for a lot of reasons, but even, you know, for psychology or as a faculty, because their, say, psych department or their unit within whatever department doesn't do what I do or isn't, you know, facilitating that in some way or wouldn't value that. So that fit to me is like just so important. I don't want to be somewhere I'm not wanted.
Yeah, yep. I think some of us that have, are in this series have felt that they, based off of their ultimate career aspirations, potentially were not wanted in their department because they didn't want to become a little professor. You know, they didn't want to perpetuate that, you know, being the next grandchild professor out of the lineage sort of thing. So I like your approach of how you approached things, but then also how you mentored your students, how you approached your students when they were going on the job market, and really that the prestige, it doesn't matter. It's the prestige of what the individual thinks, not the rest of the external applying it to you.
You know, I can't emphasize enough how I feel like I love when we have these conversations because I feel like I'm having this moment that I wish I could have just had 3 years ago, or probably 3 or 4 years ago, where I'm like, oh, okay, I'm feeling like this emotional hug because I'm around people who get it and who are with me and not felt so isolated in the moments where I felt isolated. And of course, that's kind of the core of the series. But I think one of the things that I love that you just said, Kate, is that, Sarah, you mentor students like that, right? That you mentor students about going where you want to go, right? You just said Dr. Lauder was one of your students who went to a very traditional program, right? But you also probably had students who went to programs like a PRA, right? And so you mentored them where they wanted to go. And I think that's the other thing that we haven't necessarily done a great job about in this series, but I hope we are able to find a way to build out, is this idea that even if we're speaking to students who want to go to the traditional route, that they are learning that there are students like myself and like Kate who have felt isolated along the process because we didn't want to, and that they learn those lessons to mentor students like you're suggesting that you mentor yours, which is to find places that you're at home, whether that's because you're close to family, because it's conducive for raising a family, because it's conducive to the populations that you identify with, right? Whatever it looks like for you, I think it's such an important takeaway, and that prestige can look like lots of things to lots of people. And from traditional academics, it looks like one thing, but when I move in different spaces and I talk about some of the other things, they measure prestige totally differently.
Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes it's just about understanding that maybe you're stuck in a little bit of an echo chamber when we're thinking about academic prestige. But I really appreciate, Sarah, your commentary about how you mentor your students and kind of what that means for them and the implications and the kind of legacy you're leaving behind because of your own experience.
Thank you. That also makes me feel old. But I would say, you know, I had just about 10 PhD students that I mentored during my time at mostly at NC State, and 50% of them are in AltAc spaces and 50% are in very traditional academic spaces.
Well, that is a great segue, going from traditional academic spaces to AltAc spaces. So let's chat about your departure from the university to start your position with PRA. So don't want to get too personal or anything like that if you don't want to, but what was the impetus behind that shift from, you know, traditional university setting, doing your work, to accepting your recruitment at PRA?
Yeah, so I don't know that anybody who knows me well thought that it was surprising or it was, you know, anything at all, really. Basically, I mean, I've always done very applied work, and I've worked with a lot of and collaborated with people in very applied spaces. And, near NC State, we have RTI, which is a huge opportunity for students looking for AltAc spaces. They have a lot of criminological research going on there. As a little side note, Evan Lauder's postdoc advisor, who was at IUPUI, is now at RTI. So he might be worth talking to too. He's a crim grad from NC State. But anyway, I digress. I first of all knew about PRA my entire career. So it's very big, particularly in the behavioral health, criminal justice intersection. So, Hank Stedman with others founded the company, and he's somebody who just is a very big name and, in our field and in my little subfield of risk assessment, I've always known him and John Monahan as doing some of the early work. So I knew about PRA way back when I was a graduate student. And, at the time I was getting ready to go on the job market, I was applying to more traditional academic positions, I guess. But people did say, hey, have you thought about applying to PRA? And they didn't have positions open at the time. And, I did get a recommendation from a senior male mentor who thought I should go into academia first to build up that prestige. And I don't know if that really influenced me, but I got this great offer from USF. So I went down that path. But it almost feels a little bit in a way like I was, it sounds so dorky, but like ready to come home, like with everything that was going on in the last several years. And, I was very successful. I got tenure, I got promoted, and then I got full tenure. And I was a full professor. And I honestly was at the ceremony for full professors. I was like, do I want to do this for the rest of my life? And like in the moment at this luncheon where they're celebrating all the new full professors, I was like, nope, no, I don't. And I think in that moment kind of became more open to wanting to be open to other spaces and other possibilities. Because I knew I didn't want to really go up into what the next step would be in academia, like department head or dean. Those all sound like nightmares to me. I wanted to get less into the academic side and really more into the applied, the policy. And with everything going on in the world, with COVID, with George Floyd, with everything that was just coming to a head and so relevant to all the work that I was doing, I was just having all this like, I want to do this more, not less. And it was just really fortuitous that as I was kind of feeling these feelings, and I was running my own center at the time at NC State, that I got approached and, by someone at PRA and asked if I would be willing to consider coming and open to the idea of coming to PRA. And it was literally yes. In that moment, it felt completely right. And I was like, yeah. And they were like, wow, we really thought we were going to have to do a little bit more work on you. But I think
for that hard sell,
yeah, I had already, full disclosure, entertained job offers and recruitment over the last several years before that too. And, had a few offers that had come along that just didn't feel like what I wanted to do or not quite the right thing. And then this just totally fit. And I was ready, and it was good timing for my family too. So.
Perfect. So you landed at PRA. Everybody's happy about that. So another myth that we hear a lot about in AltAc spaces is that you can't do your own work. You have no agency over your research agenda. Reflecting on your own experiences, how do you respond to that statement that you can't do your own work?
Well, I'm not going to say that experience doesn't happen to other people, but I think it's complete hooey. I have stronger words, but I don't know where that comes from. And I'm not totally clear on where that message has been so heavily institutionalized into the narrative about it. Like I said, even as a graduate student, I had a a mentor who was a few years ahead of me in graduate school, and she went off and basically started a research program at the Forensic Psychiatric Hospital near us. And, you know, she was answering important questions for the hospital and the system, but also asking her own questions. So like from the very beginning, you know, she was grant getting and seeking, you know, grants to support her own initiatives. And so that was 20 years ago. And I've always seen people do that along the way. So I just don't get why, or feel bad maybe for people who are receiving that message, because there might be more boundaries on the scope of things. But if you go to, again, an agency where there's a fit for what you want to do or what you have expertise in, I feel like you're going to be in that kind of sweet spot of what your interests are anyway. I think the difference is, the real difference for me is that we've got to fully fund that to make that happen. So, you know, in hard money academic positions, there's a little bit more freedom where you don't need to be necessarily grant funding the research or contract funding the research to be able to do it, unless it requires money to do it. But, you know, here in the AltAc space, there is the reality that we have to cover time and be able to hire people in a different way. So that's really more the consideration, is about funding, but even that has turned out to be very different than what I was worried about, to be honest. And Shannon, I know you know this space as well. You know, Shannon's organization and ours compete with each other for grants oftentimes too. But one of the things about working in agencies that have great reputations in fields that you want to work in is that actually people come to you with offers of money or funding, not money. But, you know, we've had people approach us with either me individually saying, hey, I know you're at PRA now. Would you be interested in doing this grant on this topic? Or, you know, we have this evaluation. Are you interested in it? And there's still, you know, a lot of agency like decision-making power that I certainly have in a senior position, but that I also know that other, you know, former students of mine or colleagues at other at other companies have been able to go out and get their own grants within a kind of scope of the work. And those scopes are usually big. So like PRA, our scope is, it has to be related to behavioral health. That's a pretty big scope.
Yeah. Yeah. Lots of opportunity for creativity and asking questions and figuring out a specific area. You know, I really appreciate your chatting through just some of your experiences. I have to say some of mine are quite similar. I've always said that with my position, I'm a research scientist with the Oregon Department of Corrections. I've always said that if I was a professor in a university setting, I would be asking the same exact research questions I do right now. I just wouldn't have unlimited access to really epic data that I do currently. So when I talk with students kind of in like a one-to-one mentorship sort of thing, what I say is, you know, you got to make sure that your personal mission, vision, values are in alignment with any position you find, whether it's at a university, whether it's at an agency, whether it's at the sort of organization that you and Shannon are at. The most important thing is the fit, and everything else seems to kind of like fall into place a little bit. I'm not sure. Shannon, did you have something to jump in on about that? I think I saw you unmute for a moment.
Yeah, I think what I was thinking about is this concern. Again, one of the myths of many that I heard earlier in my career was, if you go to an AltAc space, you're constantly going to be on the hook for finding money to keep your job. And I was very fearful of that. It felt like a different version of, you're going to have to continue publishing at a very specific rate to keep your job or to get promoted or to get tenure. Just felt like the same concept in a different space. And I was very nervous about that. But I think Sarah brings something up that's really important when you're choosing alternative jobs, is that in some cases reputation matters in that case specifically, because when you go to a place that has a very strong reputation, that is less of a concern for that exact reason, that people come to the center or people come to the people. And so like people approaching Sarah, people come to us for Brian very significantly. And so we're rarely in a space where I'm running around looking for grant money to help fund my position. And I'm mostly having conversations with Brian about, I don't know how you think I'm going to do all of this work. And so, and Jen, my colleague, has joined me. So she is, I'm sure, nodding her head at her computer. And so I think that's a really thoughtful contribution as a nugget or a tip for students looking at these spaces, is that typically I wouldn't say go someplace simply because of their reputation. However, in that particular case, that does matter in terms of the way that funding happens. And so if you're looking at places that are maybe not as popular, or not that they're not as reputable, but maybe their reputation isn't known yet, or they're just smaller, one of the questions I would ask then is, what do your funding streams look like? Do funders ever come to you? And that might just kind of be a filter for yourself of saying, I recognize that I'm going to have to do more work to go find money to fund my position, and I'm willing to opt into that because of the other things it offers, right? Just that kind of question allows you to have a more informed opinion about where you're going.
100%.
Completely agree. Okay, so I want to be mindful of the time, and if possible, I'd like to leave a couple moments for question and answers. So there's a couple of sort of like really practical questions that we ask of all of our rock stars in various spaces. So I'm just going to jump down a little bit. We know that you specifically, you're senior vice president of PRA, but I know there's some research intensive positions at other levels that aren't at the executive level. So since we've not had anybody from PRA specifically, can you just share a little bit about kind of what a day-to-day sort of the researchers at PRA looks like?
Research all day, every day. I mean, I'm joking, but not. We have a small but mighty research team. Our organization is smaller than a lot of these other ones that I've thrown around. So, you know, we're about 70 employees and our research department is about 5. And we have a lot of different projects that we bounce in between. But what I think is just really great for somebody who loves research and who wants to do research that is affecting like real world policy change immediately. You know, a lot of the work that we do today, we were on calls with our stakeholders in counties that we're working with, asking about some of their data, asking about their processes. And then tomorrow I'm giving a meeting to the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge Network on findings of some of the research that we've been doing so that nationwide they can be kind of doing the thing. And it feels very much like what we would be doing in academic spaces, but without, you know, that teaching and student specific mentoring. I spend still a lot of time, and, you know, the more senior researchers have one-on-one meetings with the more junior researchers. So there's still even that learning and that mentoring. But we're not, like Shannon mentioned, we're not writing grants all the time. In fact, we're trying to make a pact that we're not applying for any grants this year because we don't need them to sustain positions or funding. And it's more often talking ourselves out of grants or writing proposals because we have FOMO, because there's something so great that we want to go after, not because we need it. And like, then perfect example, we just got 2 BJA proposals that are very large and 4 to 5 years each. And we got both of them and we're like, we got both, what are we going to do?
I'm start hiring.
It's like a great, you know, problem to have. But it's really, you know, we're writing, we're doing a lot of dissemination in informal, non-traditional ways. I would say something that I love and is like a real kind of extra for me coming out of academia is having like a communications department who can help me and help my team come up with cool ways to disseminate data. Or like if we draw something on a napkin, we can like share it with them and they make it look cool and beautiful. And we just did that with this project we have with 3 counties through the MacArthur Foundation, where we mapped out one person's trajectory through the criminal justice system. And it was just like in one of my colleagues' heads, and he explained it to them, and they made it into a way that we could share what the science was showing us and what that would look like for like one person in their community. And that kind of stuff is just my favorite. And then we do things like this. We share it, reach out to the world and talk about the stuff we're doing.
Talk about the realities of the work. I love it. So you talked about dissemination, interesting dissemination strategies. Who does your target audience usually? I know you do a lot of policy relevant work, but I think you said you also do some technical assistance, training. Can you chat quickly about kind of your big areas that you work in, and then who kind of the stakeholders or the audiences for those?
Yeah, so we do work in basically all areas of behavioral health. So substantive areas are criminal legal system, juvenile justice, veterans and homelessness, housing, and sort of income assistance. I feel like I'm missing one, and I'll come back to me in a minute. But then our stakeholders are like top to bottom. So we work with the federal government. We do a lot of work with like SAMHSA, the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration, the Department of Justice, the VA. And then we also do work with local counties on the ground with people with lived experience, consumers, their families, providers, local decision makers, judges. I mean, literally all the way up the system, from the person who's using a service or needs a service all the way to the people in the federal government who are making decisions.
So interesting. It is. That's there.
And
you
then,
have so many
and then the research community somewhere over here.
I love that the research community gets it's like second fiddle. You know, yeah. It's like we do work that has direct policy impact on all these different agencies and the lives of those who live and work in our system, and we also contribute to the literature base, to the evidence base.
I feel very strongly that I want all our work to stand up to peer review. It just might not be the first thing that we do with the work.
Absolutely. That's such a good approach. Get it into the hands of the public and where it matters the most first. Okay, one more very quick question. So what kind of recommendations or advice would you have for grad students who are interested in your type of career space, like a PRA type of space? What do you look for when you're hiring? What sort of skill sets would you recommend? Experiences that somebody has when they're in grad school? What do you think are the important things to set yourself up for success in your area?
That's great. In PRA specifically, I would be very interested to see that they have any applied experience or direct contact with the systems that they say they want to work in. And that was true when I was looking for graduate students, and it's true now as well, because that understanding or that context it doesn't mean that you need to be an expert or have clinical experience or something like that, but just really to kind of know what you're talking about. So to have that real kind of, in vivo kind of experience. And then the other thing, if I'm being like completely honest, is that I want to look at somebody who just has really kick-ass methods. And if they have kick-ass quant and qual skills, either, and we're not prioritizing one or the other, but then somebody like that can work across all sorts of different areas. And, I'm really looking to see like, what can they bring to the table? I joke with some of my staff and my former students that I'm like, not looking to learn any new methods anymore. Very open to hearing them, but other people are going to bring those to the table. And so just like rounding out the team, like, what is it that we have currently? What are other new exciting things that is a new method we haven't thought of? Or, again, very interdisciplinary. Like one of our interns was talking about using GIS mapping. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. Don't know anything about it, but how could we use it to answer this question? So I really think that having a really strong methodological foundation for me is more important than a strong theoretical foundation, although that will make me unpopular with some people.
I like that you've talked a lot about creativity in multiple different ways, creativity in how you ask questions and design projects, as well as how you disseminate your findings and what is going to make the biggest impact with the specific audience that you have or the specific message that you're trying to get across. I will candidly say that I am desperately trying to get some sort of data visualization or communications sort of help like that. It's very challenging when you're not creatively inclined in that way. Shannon's got great skills in that area, I know. Okay, so it's about 1 o'clock. It's about time to wrap up. I think that Shannon said she might be able to stay on for a quick question and answer conversation session. I unfortunately am going to be jumping off. Sarah, thank you so very much for your time. Now twice you've donated your time to us to plan and to actually chat today. So again, thank you so much for sharing your story and your experiences. I love the way you framed kind of your work. You're jumping around in a very deliberate manner in order to find the best place to do the work at that time. How you've talked about what you do when you mentor students and kind of just that ingrained nature of finding what's right for you. I think that's at times a rather rare message, unfortunately. So thank you again very much for your time. And I guess we will be opening up for question and answers now. If anybody has any conversation that they'd like to have, and thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
I'll stay for a couple minutes. If anyone had any questions, I didn't see any in the chat, which is been okay. But I didn't, for the folks that are remaining, if they want to chat or unmute themselves, feel free to do so. But I think, I think ultimately at the end of the day, I'm really excited about having people, particularly folks from an interdisciplinary lens, come talk about how we can do it better. But importantly, how we start changing the culture of departments where some of us are from, where this kind of thinking is otherwise radical, where for you, you're like, why are we all not thinking like this? And for us, it's like, right, yes, Sarah, correct. But over here in our sandbox, we're thinking differently. And so I just so appreciate that, because I think there's something to be said about modeling it, changing it, talking about it, naming it, calling it out, holding a mirror to it. And so that way, as a new generation of scholars come forth, that they're not replicating old hierarchies, old narratives, and they're really supporting students earnestly and safely.
Yeah, no, I fully appreciate that. And I just, my gosh, it makes me so sad for students who aren't having that kind of positive, supportive experience. I wish I could just, hug you all. But, it's not to say that there weren't moments where, my department head said I wasn't publishing in journals that they knew about. And I was like, that's nice, but the impact factor is 12 and it's really important for the work I'm doing. It's just not in your sphere of, whatever. So, I've run into that too, but I've also always been pretty confident in my kind of centering of what I think is the right work to be doing. The rest of my life and everything, maybe less so, but in my work, I've always felt like, yeah, this work is important. And that, just has always anchored me. So
totally. Well, with that, I don't see any questions from anyone. So with that, I will thank you for your time. Oh, wait, there is, sorry. For folks that are choosing between academic versus AltAc spaces, what advice do you have for deciding where you fit best?
Well, my reaction is, why do you have to decide? And I think I don't mean it to be flippant, but I really never decided. And that was what I would always tell to my students. They're like, well, when did you figure out what you wanted to be? And I was like, I haven't. I just truly kept going on to the next interesting and kind of position that felt right. And yeah, like on the outside, it might look like I took a very kind of traditional path, and then people were like blindsided by me leaving academia, I think. But some people, I did have a couple senior colleagues go, are you sure?
Yeah.
But I would just say that just look kind of in front of you and at the opportunities as they're coming to be. And I would say just be open. If you're trying to decide, apply to all of them and see what happens. And I want to say, like, not all the universities, not all the positions, but the ones that feel like they could be a good fit. And I can maybe stay for one more question.
Yeah. So another question, and so let me go back to Amber's for a second. I believe that to be true. We've had one of our previous rock stars, Dr. Kim Crass, who teaches now at San Diego State. When she first went on the market out of UMSL, she interviewed at Pew and did postdoc interviews and ultimately took a postdoc, right? And then she went and did a traditional R1, but has otherwise also, when she went on the market again to get her San Diego job, she also went on the market and AltAc spaces. So I think that's exactly it, is going on the market should not mean going on an academic market or an only AltAc market. It's find the positions that seem to be speaking to you and then go from there. So I really think that's really thoughtful. The other question, which I'm very excited about because I feel this personally, is how do you get around the department push to have a narrow research area or interest? That one speaks to me in my core.
Yeah, I did all of the things. So that was actually a challenge. I would always say yes. And the department pushed to have a narrow interest. I think it depends if you're a student or a faculty, and I can see both having that push. I just did, maybe this is not the right answer, but I did so many different things that I was able to create like a line of research in each of them if I needed to.
Yep.
And I didn't necessarily share everything that I was doing with everyone. I mean, for example, PhD advisor and I worked on several things that were more kind of traditional psychology and law things in the area of jury decision making and more eyewitness testimony kind of stuff. But at the same time, I was working part-time as a research assistant at the forensic hospital and developing what ended up being my career in risk assessment. So, the things that I did over here, actually, in my dissertation, folks don't even usually know that my dissertation was in domestic violence, as was my master's, which is also not kind of what I'm known for in the long run. So I just did a lot. I just liked all the different things and tested them out and followed a path that took me kind of following research questions that were interesting and new ones as they emerged. I think my work in pretrial is a great example of that. I wasn't doing pretrial work 5 years ago, but it became the thing that was relevant and that I got brought into and I got asked to comment on. Same thing, I started doing work several years ago in risk assessment and threat assessment as it related to terrorism. Again, not something I ever had any insight about or intention to pursue, but it became the next important issue and application of some of my work. So
I think that's really
I would say
helpful.
Just go after the things that you are interested in is more important to me, I think, than developing this like nice narrow trajectory.
Well, I think your two offerings earlier are also helpful in that regard. One, which is looking at the backgrounds of faculty. So if you have a faculty member that came from a degree or discipline that is not in their current department, you already probably have an idea that they're going to help you find a more broader space. And then the second thing that you said that I think also applies here that I've now just lost in my head, is becoming a methodologist instead of a topic area, right? I am a trained qualitative researcher, but I would also say that I like to tell people that my special skill is context, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if I'm doing policing or courts or probation or custody settings or community violence or I don't know, something completely unrelated. Just tell me the context of what you're doing, drop me in and I can figure it out. And that is the superpower I think that I have that then transcends that I can say, I can get to work over here because this is about understanding context. And the topic area is context, not policing or courts.
Yeah,
totally.
I love it.
Well, thank you all. And thank you so much for donating 8 more minutes of your time. I really appreciate it. And then we'll, of course, have this posted on the website and we'll send this to you also so you can send it out to your networks and contacts if they're interested. And so with that, I thank you so much for your time again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon all.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.